Like a Winding Sheet by Ann Petrie. He had planned to get up before May did and surprise her by fixing breakfast. Instead, he went back to sleep, and she got out of bed so quietly he didn't know she wasn't there beside him until he woke up and heard the queer, soft gurgle of water running out of the sink in the bathroom. He knew he ought to get up, but instead he put his arms across his forehead to shut the afternoon sunlight out of his eyes, pulled his legs up close to his body, testing them to see if the ache was still in them. May had finished in the bathroom. He could tell because she never closed the door when she was in there, and now the sweet smell of talcum powder was drifting down the hall and into the bedroom. Then he heard her coming down the hall. "Hi, babe," she said affectionately. "Huh," he grunted, and moved his arms away from his head, opened one eye. "It's a nice morning." "Yeah." He rolled over, and the sheet twisted around him, outlining his thighs, his chest. "You mean afternoon, don't you?" May looked at the twisted sheet and giggled. "Looks like a winding sheet," she said. "A shroud." Laughter tangled with her words, and she had to pause for a moment before she could continue. "You look like a huckleberry in a winding sheet." "That's no way to talk early in the day like this," he protested. He looked at his arms silhouetted against the white of the sheets. They were inky black by contrast, and he had to smile in spite of himself, and he lay there smiling and savoring the sweet sound of May's giggling. "Early?" She pointed a finger at the alarm clock on the table near the bed, and giggled again. "It's almost 4 o'clock, and if you don't spring up out of there, you're going to be late again." "What do you mean, again?" "Twice last week, 3 times the week before, and once the week before, and I can't get used to sleeping in the daytime," he said fretfully. He pushed his legs out from under the covers experimentally. Some of the ache had gone out of them, but they weren't really rested yet. "It's too light for good sleeping, and all that standing beats the hell out of my legs." "After 2 years, you ought to be used to it," May said. He watched her as she fixed her hair, powdered her face, slipping into a pair of blue denim overalls. She moved quickly, and yet she didn't seem to hurry. "You look like you've had plenty of sleep," he said lazily. He had to get up, but he kept putting the moment off, not wanting to move. Yet he didn't dare let his legs go completely limp, because if he did go, he'd go back to sleep. It was getting later and later, but the thought of putting his weight on his legs kept him lying there. When he finally got up, he had to hurry, and he gulped his breakfast so fast that he wondered if his stomach could possibly use food thrown at it at such a rate of speed. He was still wondering about it as he and May were putting their coats on in the hall. May paused to look at the calendar. "It's the 13th, she said, then a faint excitement in her voice. "Why, it's Friday the 13th. She had one arm in her coat sleeve, and she held it there while she stared at the calendar. "I ought to stay home," she said. "I shouldn't go out of the house." "Aw, don't be a fool," he said. "Today's payday, and payday's a good luck day everywhere, any way you look at it." And as she stood hesitating, he said, "Aw, come on." And he was late for work again because they spent 15 minutes arguing before he could convince her she ought to go to work just the same. He had to talk persuasively, urging her gently, and it took time. But he couldn't bring himself to talk to her roughly or threaten to strike her like a lot of men might have done. He wasn't made that way. So when he reached the plant, he was late, and he had to wait to punch the time clock because the day shift workers were streaming out in long lines, in groups and bunches that impeded his progress. Even now, just starting his workday, his legs ached. He had to force himself to struggle past the outgoing workers, punch the time clock, and get the little cart he pushed around all night because he kept toying with the idea of going home and getting back in bed. He pushed the cart out of the concrete floor, thinking that if this was his plant, he'd make a lot of changes in it. There were too many standing-up jobs, for one thing. He'd figure out some way most of them could get done sitting down, and he'd put a lot more benches around. And this job he had, this job that forced him to walk 10 hours a night, pushing this little cart, well, he'd turn it into a sitting-down job. One of those little trucks they used around railroad stations would be good for a job like this. Guy sat on a seat, and the thing moved easily, taking up little room and turning in hardly any space at all, like on a dime. He pushed the cart near the foreman. He never could remember to refer to her as the forelady, even in his mind. It was funny to have a woman for a boss in a plant like this one. She was sore about something. He could tell by the way her face was red and her eyes were half shut until they were slits. Probably out late and didn't get enough sleep. He avoided looking at her and hurried a little, head down, as he passed her, though he couldn't resist stealing a glance at her out of the corner of his eyes. He saw the edge of the light-colored slacks she wore and the tip end of a big tan shoe. "Hey, Johnson," the woman said. The machine started full blast. The whir and the grinding made the building shake, made it impossible to hear conversations. The men and the women at the machines talked to each other, but looking at them from just a little distance away, they appeared to be simply moving their lips, because you couldn't hear what they were saying. Yet the woman's voice cut across the machine sounds, harsh, angry. He turned his head slowly. "Good evening, Mrs. Scott," he said, and waited. "You're late again." "That's right. My legs were bothering me." The woman's face grew redder, angrier looking. "Half the shift comes in late," she said, "and you're the worst one of all. You're always late. What's the matter with you?" "It's my legs," he said. "Somehow they don't ever get rested. I don't seem to get used to sleeping days, and I just can't get started." "Excuses. You guys always got excuses." Her anger grew and spread. "Every guy comes in here late always has an excuse. His wife's sick, or his grandmother died, or somebody in the family had to go to the hospital." She paused, drew a deep breath. "And the niggers are the worst. I don't care what's wrong with your legs. You get in here on time. I'm sick of you niggers." "You got the right to get mad," he interrupted softly. "You got the right to cuss me 4 ways to Sunday, but I ain't letting nobody call me a nigger." He stepped closer to her. His fists were doubled. His lips were drawn back into a thin, narrow line. A vein in his forehead stood out, swollen, thick. And the woman backed away from him. Not hurriedly, but slowly, 2, 3 steps back. "Aw, forget it," she said. "I didn't mean nothing by it. It slipped out. It was an accident." The red of her face deepened until the small blood vessels in her cheeks were purple. "Go on and get to work," she urged, and she took 3 more slow backward steps. He stood motionless for a moment, and then turned away from the red lipstick on her mouth that made him remember that the foreman was a woman, and he couldn't bring himself to hit a woman. He felt a curious tingling in his fingers, and he looked down at his hands. They were clenched tight, hard, ready to smash some of those purple veins in her face. He pushed the cart ahead of him, walking slowly. When he turned his head, she was staring in his direction, mopping her forehead with a dark blue handkerchief. Their eyes met, and then they both looked away. He didn't glance in her direction again, but moved past the long work benches, carefully collecting the finished parts, going slowly and steadily up and down, back and forth, the length of the building, and as he walked he forced himself to swallow his anger, get rid of it. And he succeeded, so that he was able to think about what had happened without getting upset about it. An hour went by, but the tension stayed in his hands. They were clenched and knotted on the handles of the cart, as though ready to aim a blow. And he thought he should have hit her anyway. Smacked her hard in the face. Felt the soft flesh of her face give under the hardness of his hands. He tried to make his hands relax by offering them a description of what it would have been like to strike her, because he had the queer feeling that his hands were not exactly a part of him anymore. They had developed a separate life of their own, over which he had no control. So he dwelt on the pleasure his hands would have felt, both of them cracking at her, first one and then the other. If he had done that, his hands would have felt good now, relaxed, rested. And he decided that even if he'd lost his job for it, he should have let her have it, and it would have been a long time, maybe the rest of her life, before she called anybody else a nigger. The only trouble was, he couldn't hit a woman. A woman couldn't hit back the same way a man did. But it would have been a deeply satisfying thing to have cracked the narrow lips wide open with just one blow, beautifully timed with all the weight in his back of it. That way, he would have gotten rid of all the energy and tension his anger had created in him. He kept remembering how his heart had started pumping blood so fast he had felt it tingle even in the tips of his fingers. When the approach of the night fatigue nibbled at him. The corners of his mouth dropped. The frown between his eyes deepened. His shoulders sagged, but his hands stayed tight and tense, and the hours dragged by. He noticed that the women workers had started to snap and snarl at each other. He couldn't hear what they said because of the sound of the machines, but he could see the quick lip movements that sent words tumbling from the sides of their mouths. They gestured irritably with their hands and scowled as their mouths moved. Their violent, jerky motions told him that it was getting close on to quitting time, but somehow he felt that the night still stretched ahead of him, composed of endless hours of steady walking on his aching legs. When the whistle finally blew, he went on pushing the cart, unable to believe that it had sounded. The whirring of the machines died away to a murmur, and he knew then that he really had heard the whistle. He stood still for a moment, filled with relief that made him sigh. Then he moved briskly, putting the cart in the storeroom, hurrying to take his place in the line forming before the paymaster. That was another thing he'd change, he thought. He'd have the pay envelopes handed to the people right at their benches, so there wouldn't be 10 or 15 minutes lost waiting for their pay. He always got home about 15 minutes late on payday. They did it better in the plant where May worked, brought the money right to them at their benches. He stuck his pay envelope in his pants pocket and followed the line of workers heading for the subway in a slow-moving stream. He glanced up at the sky. It was a nice night. The sky looked packed full to running over with stars, and he thought if he and May would go right to bed when they got home from work, they'd catch a few hours of darkness for sleeping. But they never did. They fooled around, cooking and eating and listening to the radio, and he always stayed in a big chair in the living room and went almost but not quite to sleep, and when they finally got to bed it was 5 or 6 in the morning and daylight was already seeping around the edges of the sky. He walked slowly, putting off the moment when he would have to plunge into the crowd hurrying toward the subway. It was a long ride to Harlem, and tonight the thought of it appalled him. He paused outside an all-night restaurant to kill time, so that some of the first rush of workers would be gone when he reached the subway. The lights in the restaurant were brilliant, enticing. There was life and motion inside, and he looked through the window. He thought that everything within range of his eyes gleamed. The long imitation marble counter, the tall stools, the white porcelain-topped tables, and especially the big metal coffee urn right near the window. Steam issued from its top, and a gas flame flickered under it, a lively, dancing blue flame. A lot of the workers from the shift, men and women, were lining up near the coffee urn. He watched them walk to the porcelain-topped tables, carrying steaming cups of coffee, and he saw that just the smell of the coffee lessened the fatigue lines in their faces. After the first sip, their faces softened. They smiled. They began to talk and laugh. On a sudden impulse, he shoved the door open and joined the line in front of the coffee urn. The line moved slowly, and as he stood there, the smell of the coffee, the sound of the laughter and the voices, helped dull the sharp ache in his legs. He didn't pay any attention to the girl who was serving the coffee at the urn. He kept looking at the cups in the hands of the men who had been ahead of him. Each time a man stepped out of line with one of the thick white cups, the fragrant steam got in his nostrils. He saw that they walked carefully so as not to spill a single drop. There was a froth of bubbles at the top of each cup, and he thought about how he would let the bubbles break against his lips before he actually took a deep swallow. Then it was his turn. "A cup of coffee," he said, just as he had heard the others say. The girl looked past him, put her hands up to her head, and gently lifted her hair away from the back of her neck, tossing her head back a little. "No more coffee for a while," she said. He wasn't certain he heard her correctly, and he said, "What?" blankly. "No more coffee for a while," she repeated. There was silence behind him, and then uneasy movement. He thought someone would say something, ask why or protest, but there was only silence, and then a faint shuffling sound, as though the men standing behind him had simultaneously shifted their weight from one foot to the other. He looked at her without saying anything. He felt her hands begin to tingle, and the tingling went all the way down to his fingertips, so that he glanced down at them. They were clenched tight, hard, into fists. Then he looked at the girl again. What he wanted to do was hit her so hard that the scarlet lipstick on her mouth would smear and spread over her nose, her chin, out towards her cheeks, so hard that she would never toss her head again and refuse a man a cup of coffee because he was black. He estimated the distance across the counter and reached forward, balancing his weight on the balls of his feet. ready to let the blow go. And then his hands fell back down to his sides, because he forced himself to lower them, to unclench them, and make them dangle loose. The effort took his breath away, because his hands fought against him. But he couldn't hit her. He couldn't even now bring himself to hit a woman, not even this one, who had refused him a cup of coffee with a toss of her head. He kept seeing the gesture with which she had lifted the length of her blonde hair from the back of her neck as an expressive of her contempt for him. When he went out the door, he didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen the flickering blue flame under the shiny coffee urn being extinguished. The line of men who had stood behind him lingered a moment to watch the people drinking coffee at the tables, and then they left just as he had, without having had the coffee they wanted so badly. The girl behind the counter poured water in the urn, swabbed it out, and as she waited for the water to run out, she lifted her hair gently from the back of her neck and tossed her head before she began making a fresh lot of coffee. But he walked away without a backward look, his head down, his hands in his pocket, raging at himself and whatever it was inside of him that had forced him to stand quiet and still when he wanted to strike out. The subway was crowded, and he had to stand. He tried grasping an overhead strap, and his hands were too tense to grip it. So he moved near the train door and stood there, swaying back and forth with the rocking of the train. The roar of the train beat inside his head, making it ache and throb, and the pain in his legs clawed up into his groin, so that he seemed to be bursting with pain, and he told himself that it was due to all the anger-born energy that had piled up in him, and had not been used, and so it had spread through him like a poison, from his feet and his legs, all the way up to his head. May was in the house before he was. He knew she was home before he put the key in the door of the apartment. The radio was going. She had it tuned up loud, and she was singing along with it. "Hello, babe," she called out as soon as he opened the door. He tried to say hello, and it came out half a grunt and half sigh. "You sure sound cheerful," she said. She was in the bedroom, and he went and leaned against the door jamb. The denim overalls she wore to work were carefully draped over the back of a chair by the bed. She was standing in front of the dresser, tying the sash of a yellow housecoat around her waist and chewing gum vigorously as she admired her reflection in the mirror over the dresser. "What's the matter?" she said. "You get bawled out by the boss or something?" "Just tired," he said slowly. "For God's sake, do you have to crack that gum like that?" "You don't have to listen to me," she said complacently. She patted a curl in place near the side of her head and then lifted her hair away from the back of her neck, ducking her head forward and then back. He winced away from the gesture. "What you got to be always fooling with your hair for?" he protested. "Say, what's the matter with you anyway?" She turned away from the mirror to face him, put her hands on her hips. "You ain't been in the house 2 minutes and you're picking on me." He didn't answer her because her eyes were angry, and he didn't want to quarrel with her. They'd been married too long and got along too well, and so he walked all the way into the room and sat down in the chair by the bed and stretched his legs out in front of him, putting his weight on the heels of his shoes, leaning way back in the chair, not saying anything. "Listen," she said sharply, "I gotta wear those overalls again tomorrow. You're gonna get them all wrinkled up leaning against them like that." He didn't move. He was too tired, and his legs were throbbing now that he had sat down. Besides, the overalls were already wrinkled and dirty, he thought. They couldn't help but be, for she'd worn them all week. He leaned further back in the chair. "Come on, get up," she ordered. "Oh, what the hell," he said wearily and got up from the chair. "I'd just as soon live in a subway. There'd be just as much place to sit down." He saw that her sense of humor was struggling with her anger. But her sense of humor won because she giggled. "Aw, come on and eat," she said. There was a coaxing note in her voice. "You're nothing but an old hungry nigger trying to act tough and—" She paused to giggle and then continued, "You—" He had always found her giggling pleasant, and deliberately said things that might amuse her, and then waited, listening for the delicate sound to emerge from her throat. This time, he didn't even hear the giggle. He didn't let her finish what she was saying. She was standing close to him, and that funny tingling started in his fingertips, went fast up his arms, and sent his fist shooting straight for her face. There was the smacking sound of soft flesh being struck by a hard object, and it wasn't until she screamed that he realized he had hit her mouth so hard that the dark red lipstick had blurred and spread over her full lips, reaching up towards the tip of her nose, down towards her chin, out towards her cheeks. The knowledge that he had struck her seeped through him slowly, and he was appalled, but he couldn't drag his hands away from her face. He kept striking her, and he thought with horror that something inside of him was holding him, binding him to this act, wrapping and twisting around him so that he had to continue it. He had lost all control over his hands, and he groped for a phrase, a word, something to describe what this thing was like that was happening to him, and he thought it was like being enmeshed in a winding sheet. That was it, like a winding sheet. And even as the thought formed in his mind, his hands reached for her face again and yet again.